The history of the Denmark-Canada land border, a tale of Hans Island. The idea of Denmark and Canada sharing a land border might seem improbable at first glance, given the vast geographical distance between the two nations. However, this unique border exists on a tiny, uninhabited island in the Arctic region known as Hans Island. The history of this border is a fascinating story of territorial claims, international diplomacy, and the evolving dynamics of Arctic sovereignty. This essay explores the history of the Denmark-Canada land border, focusing on the dispute over Hans Island, its resolution, and its significance in the broader context of Arctic geopolitics. Now, before we move on, please help a small channel grow. Please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, good or bad, leave them below. Back to the story. 1. Introduction. The unlikely border. Denmark and Canada are separated by the North Atlantic Ocean, with thousands of kilometers of water between them. However, in the remote and icy reaches of the Arctic, the two nations share a land border on Hans Island, a small, barren rock measuring just 1.3 square kilometers. This border is not only a geographical curiosity but also a symbol of the complexities of Arctic sovereignty and international relations. Hans Island is located in the Kennedy Channel, part of the Nares Strait, which separates Ellesmere Island, Canada, from Greenland, an autonomous territory of Denmark. The island itself is uninhabited and lacks any significant resources, but its location in a strategically important region has made it a focal point of diplomatic negotiations between Denmark and Canada. 2. Early history and territorial claims. The history of Hans Island is intertwined with the broader history of Arctic exploration and territorial claims. The island was first documented by European explorers in the 19th century during expeditions to the Arctic. It was named after Hans Hendrik, a Greenlandic Inuit guide who accompanied American and British explorers on their journeys through the region. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both Denmark and Canada began to assert their sovereignty over parts of the Arctic. Denmark's claim was based on its historical ties to Greenland, which had been under Danish control since the 18th century. Canada, on the other hand, sought to establish its presence in the Arctic as part of its broader nation-building efforts. The status of Hans Island, however, remained unclear for much of this period. The island's small size and remote location meant that it was largely ignored in early territorial negotiations. It was not until the mid-20th century that the issue of sovereignty over Hans Island began to emerge as a point of contention between Denmark and Canada. 3. The emergence of the dispute over Hans Island can be traced back to the 1970s, when both Denmark and Canada began to take a more active interest in the Arctic region. This was driven in part by the potential for resource extraction, as well as the strategic importance of the Arctic during the Cold War. In 1973, Denmark and Canada negotiated a treaty to delineate the maritime boundary between Greenland and Canada in the Nares Strait. The treaty established a clear boundary line, but it did not explicitly address the status of Hans Island, which lies directly on the boundary. This omission set the stage for the dispute that would follow. Both Denmark and Canada began to assert their claims to Hans Island in the years that followed. Danish and Canadian officials visited the island periodically, planting their respective flags and leaving behind bottles of spirits as a symbolic gesture of ownership. These actions, while largely symbolic, highlighted the growing tension between the two nations over the island's status. 4. The Whisky War. The dispute over Hans Island gained international attention in the 1980s and 1990s, when it became known as the Whisky War. This nickname referred to the practice of Danish and Canadian officials leaving bottles of whiskey and schnapps on the island during their visits. While the dispute was largely peaceful, it underscored the seriousness with which both nations viewed the issue of Arctic sovereignty. The Whisky War was characterized by a series of diplomatic exchanges and symbolic gestures. For example, in 1984, Canadian soldiers planted a Canadian flag on the island and left behind a bottle of Canadian whiskey. In response, Danish officials visited the island and replaced the Canadian flag with a Danish flag, leaving behind a bottle of Danish schnapps. These actions were repeated several times over the years, with both sides refusing to back down. Despite the light-hearted nature of these exchanges, the dispute over Hans Island has serious implications for Arctic geopolitics. The Arctic region is home to vast reserves of natural resources, including oil, gas, and minerals, and control over territory in the region is seen as increasingly important in the context of climate change and the melting of Arctic ice. 5. The path to resolution. The dispute over Hans Island remained unresolved for several decades, but in the early 21st century, both Denmark and Canada began to take steps toward a resolution. This was driven in part by the growing recognition of the need for cooperation in the Arctic, as well as the desire to avoid escalating tensions in the region. In 2005, Denmark and Canada agreed to begin formal negotiations over the status of Hans Island. These negotiations were part of a broader effort to resolve outstanding boundary issues in the Arctic, including the delimitation of the continental shelf. The talks were conducted in a spirit of cooperation, with both sides expressing a commitment to finding a mutually acceptable solution. After years of negotiations, Denmark and Canada reached an agreement in 2022 to divide Hans Island along a natural ridge that runs through its center. Under the agreement, the island was split roughly in half, with the western portion going to Canada and the eastern portion going to Denmark. This solution allowed both nations to maintain their claims to the island while avoiding further conflict. 6. Significance of the border. The resolution of the Hans Island dispute is significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates the ability of nations to resolve territorial disputes through peaceful means, even in a region as strategically important as the Arctic. The agreement between Denmark and Canada sets a positive precedent for other nations with overlapping claims in the Arctic. Second, the establishment of a land border between Denmark and Canada highlights the growing importance of the Arctic in global geopolitics. As climate change continues to open up new shipping routes and resource extraction opportunities in the region, the need for clear and mutually agreed upon boundaries will only increase. Finally, the history of the Denmark-Canada land border serves as a reminder of the complexities of sovereignty and territorial claims in the modern world. Even a small, uninhabited island like Hans Island can become a focal point of international diplomacy, underscoring the importance of cooperation and dialogue in resolving disputes. 7. Conclusion. The history of the Denmark-Canada land border is a unique and fascinating story of territorial claims, international diplomacy, and the evolving dynamics of Arctic sovereignty. What began as a minor dispute over a tiny, uninhabited island ultimately became a symbol of the challenges and opportunities facing nations in the Arctic region. The resolution of the Hans Island dispute through peaceful negotiations is a testament to the importance of diplomacy and cooperation in addressing complex geopolitical issues. As the Arctic continues to play an increasingly important role in global affairs, the lessons learned from the history of the Denmark-Canada land border will remain relevant for years to come. In the end, the story of Hans Island is not just about a small piece of land in the Arctic, it is about the broader challenges of sovereignty, resource management, and international relations in a rapidly changing world. The Denmark-Canada land border may be small in size, but its significance is anything but. Please like and subscribe.